OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about limits are limitless as featured in the absolute choice, considering the fundamental limits of Alexander Ebert with the radical contingency of Quentin Melissu and freak materialism. So this paper is going to be talking about the work mainly of Alexander Ebert, freak theory, which he has a fantastic paper about in the Enter the Alien anthology from Philosophy Portal on the sublation of mathematics, but you can also find online. He had a conversation with Dr. Henriquez about it. Technosocial. It's really a wonderful schema by which to understand the movement and unfolding of reality, and I really appreciate it. I think it maps on incredibly well and helps bring out some of the more difficult thinking in Hegel, notably the sections on attraction and repulsion and the doctrine of being, book 1 of the Science of Logic. And I have over the years found myself using freak theory without even thinking about it. That's how useful it is. I think that's always a big test. If you just find yourself using it, that tends to be an indication that it is a very powerful theory. The paper is going to start by noting the work or the claim of the great Stephen Houlgate, Dr. Houlgate, who Philippe Nicholas, the great Dr. Philippe Nicholas, brought to my attention on the idea that Hegel brings forth or presents a presuppositionless philosophy. But what exactly does this mean? That would mean it would be a philosophy that does not assume anything. It has no presuppositions. It is completely its own justification without assuming anything. But of course, that kind of sounds absurd. How is that even possible, right? Well, maybe here's the kind of funny thing, if we say it's impossible to have presuppositionless thought, if we say, for example, it's impossible to answer the meta question, as Samuel Barnes writes on in his tremendous Iconoclast, that is a limit. There's a limit to what we can say. What's fascinating about Mr. Ebert's work is that he's going to claim that limitation itself is most fundamental, the fact that we are always limited. And this brings to mind the notion that finitude is the ground of thought, and that the infinite comes from the finite versus the finite and the infinite be in opposition, which is bringing to mind Hegel's true infinity. And so Mr. Ebert is going to suggest that the very fact that we cannot think without presupposition is a limit, which, and here's the key, this limit is encountered. It is not something you assume, you just find yourself having to incorporate it. Well, this right there would suggest that limit is not presuppositional. It is something you just encounter. And I think, in our talk, our OG Rose conversation, number 161, we asked the question, is death presuppositional? And it's a kind of funny question, but I think it's quite clear that you don't presuppose death. Death occurs. It's just something you encounter. And even if you somehow create a way to live forever, some transhumanist dream, life extendency, whatever, well, you didn't have a choice but to deal with the problem, so you were limited in that sense. You had to deal with the problem of death, and so there's a kind of limitation there. And so, well, what we're seeing here is that limits, ontology is defined by limits, even if somehow the ontic is not, and the very fact we can't say either way is further proof of the fundamentals of limitation. Limits are axiomatic, and in fact, it almost seems wrong to say limits are axiomatic. They just are there, hence perhaps why Hegel encourages us to look on, which is an allusion to the beginning of the phenomenology, to look on. And so what we see here is that the other key to a limit, in it being encountered, I think we can associate it with Lacan's the real, per se, the surprise that I've spoken with Matthew Alice about, and it has to be situated in a kind of commitment, because when you're committed to something, then you're continuing to relate to it over and over again, possibly as a true infinity, so you can encounter the unexpected. And the unexpected is the limitation, and if it's unexpected, then it can't have a presupposition. You just encounter it. And so limitation as presuppositionless seems quite justified, because indeed we don't plan for it, it just happens. And so what would it mean to have a philosophy that's grounded or that's based on the assumption that you're going to encounter things you cannot assume ahead of time, and that you're limited from knowing exactly what you're going to encounter ahead of time, and that the philosophy is based on the encounter with the limit, ergo the limitation. And the phenomenology, as Cadell teaches on, is a constant movement of, say, consciousness encountering the limit, self-consciousness encountering the limit, reason encountering the limit, spirit, religion, and an absolute knowing that there's this constant encounter with limitation. And that limitation is, of course, a negativity. You experience limitation as a negativity, but the limit is more primary than the negativity, because I think there's this kind of question of what is first. Is it negativity? In a sense, because you have to encounter the limit, but the experience of the negativity comes from the encounter of the limit. It is not primary in that sense. And what Ebert will also kind of stress is that when we encounter the limitation that causes a negativity is a result of an excess that we cannot fully conceptualize. Therefore, we feel ourselves lacking. And I think this is, to me, fascinating, because there's this kind of question of how we might think this. Nature seems to be very rhizomatic in a Deleuzian sense, very excessive, it's unfolding, it's very creative, and yet the subject seems to experience itself as very lacking, looking at Lacan and psychoanalytical. And there seems to be a ditch on either side of the road. There can be this, well, let's talk about lack in a manner that's almost nihilistic, like overly nihilistic, but then there's also a kind of naive sense of, well, everything is creative and unfolding, and we don't have to work with negativity. Both of these seem very problematic. And definitely, I think there are efforts today. I hesitate. I brought up new materialism in my talk with Mr. Ebert, but that's such a broad category, and it means many things to many people, and Cadell was right to bring that out in the comments. As I understand it, there are notions of new materialism that emphasizes the vibrancy of matter, the creativity, and that we as humans just need to kind of align with that, and that the subject is often more so just a product of discourse, of the society, of the language. The subject is not something that exists outside of social intelligibility. Russell and Cadell had a wonderful talk about this. I think this is not the case. I think there is a subjectivity that is a negativity that is not simply a product of social conditioning or the quote-unquote discourse. We experience lack as very fundamental. And what we have in Ebert here is a notion that fundamental lack we experience is a result of the kind of the interplay between the finite scope and finite experience we have and that which exceeds that finite scope. And so we're lacking that which is beyond our finitude, our membrane, you could even say. And you see, if lack is a product of that, lack is a product of relations. But here's the thing. If relations are ontological and real, as many people in the liminal web are now stressing, then to say that lack is sourced from the relation is not to say the lack is an illusion or that it is not fundamental or part of us as beings. No, the lack is very fundamental. But it emerges, here's the key, because it's fundamental, but it's fundamental from and in and because of the limit of our finitude to be incapable of taking the full excess of what exceeds us. So the limit of finitude leads to the lack. The lack is not below the limit, if you will. The limit leads to the lack. And I think this is a very elegant description because it helps bring together how we can take seriously the lack in Lacan as a kind of taking up our cross, or kind of struggling, or taking death seriously. I think if we don't take death seriously, we become pathological. We can see lack as something that we have to live with and to truly integrate with and face, but we don't make the lack a source of nihilism. And I've spoken with Mr. Jockin many times on the idea that lacks are not nothing, and I think that's very important. Lacks are a present absence, and we try to think Aristotle with Lacan, and lack can tie into mystery, beauty, the unknown, something that's always pulling us in deeper. Lack can be a river hole, as Cadell talks about in Systems and Subjects, a source of negentropy, not just entropy. And so lack, as not nothing, is indeed a present absence, and what's absent to us is what is present in the excess. And so it is invitational, not a source of nihilism. Because I think for me, it's very important that lack not become nihilistic. It needs to be hard. It needs to be very hard. Because humans seem to not do very well without negativity. But we don't want it to become, for me at least, hopeless. Because once it becomes hopeless, it's just nihilism, and that's a problem. But again, at the same time, there seems to be a very, as I mentioned in the paper and mentioned with Alex, that there's a kind of cheap Deleuzianism that's rhizomatic that I think doesn't work through negativity, and thus It doesn't take seriously the problems of relationships, and I think that sets people up for failure. There's a costly delusionism, though, that goes through Lacan, if you will, that I think is extremely important. I'll also talk about, in the absolute choice, how I think we can think about Hegel as intersuppositional, not just like presuppositional, but by intersuppositional, I mean suppositions that are a result of relations. Well, that would be the encounter, the surprise, the coming upon something unexpected. And so the intersuppositional, I would also associate with the presuppositionlessness of the limit and ergo death. The paper is also going to compare Ebert's work with Quentin Malissou of the speculative realism, and then Quentin, and Graham Harman talks about this in his book about Quentin, he's going to try to make contingency kind of the most fundamental reality, not limit. So everything is based on contingency. And I think it's a very beautiful model of reality. I think it's very compelling. However, I think ultimately, as the paper will try to argue, that it is more plausible that limit is more fundamental than contingency. Now, to explain, what Quentin wants to do is overcome what he calls coherent kind of correspondenceism, and by that he wants to talk about kind of the Kantian devastation, the Kantian event that kind of ruined everything, which is to say that we can never know if thought is of the actual or only of itself. I think he calls it correlation, the correlationism of Kant. And so what Quentin's curious is if we can have thought of the actual absolute, not just thought of itself that can never be sure if it's participating in the absolute beyond just some sort of correlation with it. I certainly applaud Quentin in focusing on this problem because I think it is a problem. Well, what Quentin's going to do is argue that if you say, so to put this very simply, if you say that my idea of a pen might have something to do with actuality, then you know absolutely that it might, that there's a might. Because if you say there is no chance of it, you'd have to be across the noumenon, right? Per se. And so the might, the contingency itself becomes absolute. You can't deny the contingency. And so Quentin is suggesting we can absolutely know contingency and thus have absolute knowledge in so much as we can know of contingency. And Quentin is also going to suggest there has to be the possibility of being without thought, without the correlationism, you could say nature without notion, to use that language I use with Hegel, because we have ancestral fossils. We have fossils of a world before human consciousness, so there must have been being without thought. Likewise, we have stars that the light is just reaching us, and all of this is existence without consciousness. So that would suggest there was being can exist without consciousness. The question is, can we access it? And Quentin wants to base that on contingency. We can know absolutely contingently. Well, here's the next move, as I understand it, though, is that then he's like, all right, well, if we can know contingently, absolutely, if everything was contingent, as in was contingent in the most radical sense, then we could have absolute knowledge about everything. Now, this requires to basically say there's no such thing as natural law. There's no necessity at all. This quote, everything could actually collapse, from trees to stars, from stars to laws, from physical laws to logical laws, but by virtue of the absence of any superior law, capable of preserving anything, no matter what, from perishing. And I think this is a pretty incredible move. So what he's saying is that there's no necessity, and if what we can know absolutely is contingency, and if everything was contingent, well, then we can in fact have absolute knowledge. And since we know contingency exists, and we know that things may or may not exist. We know that contingency describes everything, so why not just say that contingency based on experience is everything at the most deepest level? Well, that would give us grounds for absolute knowledge, to believe that knowledge has a certain absoluteness to it. Now, the argument goes on from there. There's way more to say because he has to somehow explain stability. Like, okay, fine, Quentin, everything is radically contingent, but we certainly seem to experience a certain stability. How does that work? And, he's going to be like, well, the hyperchaos is so contingent that even flux is contingent. So flux doesn't have to happen because that itself is contingent. So he has answers for all this. And I think it is an internally consistent system. I think there's no necessary contradiction in speculative realism. However, The probability that contingency is most fundamental, I think, is not as high as the probability that limitation is most fundamental, and I think Mr. Ebert makes this case powerfully. And to put it very simply, if contingency is itself, so this is kind of an axiomatic sort of notion. So if contingency is most fundamental, there is actually one contingency that contingency could not realize, and that would be non-contingency. If contingency became non-contingent, well, then it couldn't be itself. It couldn't become contingent again. And so contingency being most fundamental is completely contingent upon it never realizing the non-contingent. And over enough time, it seems like every possible contingency would be realized, and then that would be that. Contingency couldn't be most fundamental. It couldn't describe everything, and the basis of absolute of knowledge that overcomes correlationism would no longer be consistent. However, if limit is most fundamental reality, and limit falls back and limits itself of its own material, mind you, which is limit, the limit could limit itself and thus become unlimited. It could limit itself from being limited, thus become unlimited. And here's the key. In the unlimited can create limit again because it is not limited. So the unlimited can give you the limited. And then if it becomes limited, the limited could fall back on itself and limit itself and create for the unlimited again, on and on and on. Furthermore, the limited could limit itself. And it could limit itself and limit itself unlimitedly because limit contains its own limit. And if you say, well, the limit limits itself from being limited, and now I've said the word limited like 40 times really fast, if limit limits itself, then it's unlimited. And if you say that limit cannot limit itself, well, then it's unlimited. And you see, at this point, it would suggest that limitation entails a certain dynamic. There's nothing in limit that would necessitate its end. Whereas contingency, if it realized the contingency of non-contingency, would end. It couldn't maintain dynamicism anymore. Limit could fall back on itself as limitation and stay dynamic. And so it is more probable that limitation is more fundamental than contingency. I mean, also, if there's nothing that is finite, limit is finitude. And if there's nothing that's finite, what could be contingent? The infinite? Well, the infinite realizes everything. It's not contingent at all, right? So there would have to be a finitude to be contingent. But if there's a finitude, there is limitation. And so the contingency of limitation could perhaps be limiting itself, but contingency cannot be primary. Contingency cannot be a thing itself. And if you say everything is contingent, you are saying that everything consists within itself some sort of ontological principle that would make it changeable, ergo dynamic, and that would be limit. Following Mr. Ebert, limit is the very thing that makes contingency possible, but that means limit makes contingency possible, not that contingency makes limit possible. And that would suggest that limit is more fundamental than contingency. And, if this is so, please note that it would suggest the word limit doesn't mean what we think it means. Limit actually probably means dialectic. Like Hegel describes. And the dialectic is not merely either or. Dialectic is the unfolding of things into otherness according to its own internal tension, which we see in the very fact that I can't describe a bookcase or a tree without moving into otherness. To describe the tree, I have to describe the limbs, then soil, then seeds. I'm automatically, the act of intelligibility is a movement into otherness. Well, likewise, limit seems to be a principle that moves into otherness, because when limit limits itself, then it is other. The moment it limits itself, it is other, but here's the key. It is other, but it is still itself. And that's the Hegel move. Because for Hegel, becoming other is not changing into something else. Becoming other is for the thing that is there to become something else in itself as itself. AB entails AA. It is not A to B, but AB with a slash, like things are bothness. Are bothness. Contingency is for a thing to change into something else that is radically other than what it was. Whereas for limit to become something else, for limit to limit itself into becoming something else, then limit but uses its own principle to limit itself, but then as long as it's still finite, it's limiting itself into something that it also is. So there's a becoming in the isness. You could say becoming with the BE in parentheses is how I've written it. And I think Mr. Ebert describes this very well in his paper. So contingency changes into something else, whereas limit itself as something else, into, like, it is that otherness. And that that kind of transcends a mere kind of Heraclitus contingency. Now the limitation is the becoming. It entails its own tension to becoming. And also, if limitation limits itself into something unlimited, the unlimited entails the potentiality for limitation, because if it did not, it would be limited from entailing limit. And then if that was the case, it'd be limited. You see, you can't get around this. It's always going to fall back in on itself and bring about its own principle, its own fundamental logic. And thus it has the structure of a true infinity, not a spurious infinity. It's imaginable that contingency could be spurious, always something else, always something else. But limit can be a true infinity, meaning it refers back on itself, but changes in a sublation in that very reference on itself. And then in this way, limit entails the very substance that it needs in itself by being itself to become something else. Limit is limit, it entails limit, and if it limits itself, it becomes unlimited, which then entails the possibility of limit, because it is unlimited. If it didn't entail the possibility of limit, it would be limited. So all you need is limit, and in that very fundamental principle, you have what you need for becoming other, while maintaining itself. And I think that's critical to describe Hegel and the science of logic, and to describe reality. And then in this, you get the negativity of a Lacan in limitation with the dynamic creativity of Deleuze. Because the limit, the negativity, the real, is the principle of creation, as opposed to being free of limitation, which I think is the cheap Deleuzian that can be kind of dangerous. And I would describe all this as freak materialism, with the Q, as based on, not just dialectical materialism or new materialism. Not that I'm saying those are bad fields, I'm just saying that what Ebert kind of gives us here, I almost want to call like a freak materialism, which I think takes seriously these problems that we're trying to describe. I think it also helps us think another principle of Mr. Ebert is the magnetic zero. I think the zero, which is the kind of the plus one of nature, materiality, and the minus one of lack, the plus one of excess, comes together in the interplay with the lack of finitude that has this equivalent. It becomes equivalent, not equal to a magnetic zero, to realize an equilibrium. But that zero can't exist in nature, because there's no such thing as equaling. You can't equal zero, even if there was such thing as zero. And instead what happens is you get an interplay, a movement, a wave-like movement, as Ebert describes, where the lack and the excess are working toward a saturation point that has the equivalence of zero, of which then is the sublation. That's the beginning of a new wave. Like, it's a saturation is nothing, and the nothing is the everything, the nothing of everything, as Hegel puts it. And so the paper tries to go through that, but Mr. Ebert also describes that at his Stoa presentation, I believe, which is brilliant. And we can also think this with Layman Pascal's work on the metaphysics of adjacency. In the paper, we'll go into that, and we also describe that and how the absolute might move. So that's quite enjoyable, and I think this also has bearings on Cadell's excellent presentation at the University of Essex, I believe, on the difference between neuroscience and psychoanalysis. I think that's outstanding, and I think hopefully this also goes with the Thomas Jockin conversation I had, where we talk about kind of the partial object, but the partial object is partial in space, not in time. And I think that's very important, because there's this weird idea of how can a partial object exist? Well, it's partial on the side of understanding, but not on reason. And the completion is temporal, in the fullness of time, which is radically open. But then completion is precisely the orientation to that radical openness, which we try to bring out with Mr. Jockin. So I think Mr. Ebert's work is extremely useful, extremely well done. I think it helps us deal with some deep metaphysical problems. And I think it helps us think Deleuze, Hegel, and Lacan together, which would probably make openings to think people like Schelling and Whitehead, as Matthew Segal was speaking with Cadell about. But anyway, I would highly suggest Mr. Ebert's work. I think indeed there is reason based on it to think that limitation is most fundamental, and that this is presuppositionless, like that limit as is a presuppositionless philosophy. And with that, we then have a very solid foundation, by which to think and to work with philosophy, which is making limitation central. The paper will get into more, but for more by Mr. Alex Ebert, please visit Bad Guru, his Substack. Please check out his works in the philosophy portal anthologies. And thank you so much for your time.